In my last lecture, I suggested that a book is a complex space, one much bigger on the inside than its physical dimensions would imply. In this lecture, I ask, what does it mean to lose yourself, or to find yourself, in a book? What does it mean when we curl up with a book and our imagination begins to roam and suddenly we find ourselves lost in the story it tells? The comic book literary autobiography teaches us a powerful truth about literature. It teaches us that literature makes the self external, and in doing so, it allows us to see ourselves, to perceive our problems and gifts as if externally, outside of ourselves. Comics do this so very effectively because they represent the self twice over, in words and in pictures. And so, to conclude this week's argument that comics teach us to think about all art, I say that comics teach us that there is no first person. That is, they show us that by losing ourself in a book, we actually dissolve our first person self, our I, and have the opportunity to think outside of ourselves and to identify with another self, the allegory within. I make this argument through two lectures on Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, a family tragicomedy. Like Maus, Fun Home is a story of ghosts, of the dead. It takes its name from the Bechdel family's funeral home, which the family called Fun Home, a joking pun because the funeral home is not a fun place and because Alison Bechdel's childhood home was far from fun itself. In Fun Home, Alison Bechdel exorcises her own ghosts. She tells the mystery of her father, Bruce Bechdel's death, that he stepped out in front of a speeding Sunbeam bread truck, and she relates both her own problems with writing and her difficulty coming out as a lesbian. The book cannot provide direct answers to this history. It cannot tell us whether Bruce was involved in a horrible accident or whether he committed suicide, and it cannot resolve Alison Bechdel's childhood, but it can dissolve her, and by extension us, in its labyrinth of pages, and thus allow author and reader to think deeply about who they are and who they might be, and how words shape those identities. Alison Bechdel is the author, before Fun Home, of the comic strip Dykes to Watch Out For, and, after it, the graphic novel Are You My Mother? She writes literary autobiography after Maus. Fun Home follows Maus in a number of ways. It is like Maus in its physical size and shape. It is also like Maus in that it is chiefly a story of paternity, which it sets out on its very first page. Like many fathers, mine could occasionally be prevailed on for a spot of airplane. As he launched me, my full weight would fall on the pivot point between his feet and my stomach. Oof! It was a discomfort well worth the rare physical contact, and certainly worth the moment of perfect balance when I soared above him. In the circus, acrobatics, where one person lies on the floor balancing another, are called Icaran Games. Icaran Games. Icarus was trapped with his father, the master craftsman Daedalus, in the labyrinth on Crete. Daedalus had actually built the labyrinth to imprison the half-man, half-bull Minotaur. In order to escape, Daedalus made wings of wax and feathers for them both, warning Icarus not to fly too high. Unable to contain the joy of flight, Icarus soared, and his wings melted in the sun's glow. The page captures this sense of soaring in its image of balance. The last page of the book completes the first by showing little Alison again in flight. And so the book at the beginning and at the end traces a labyrinth, as she writes here, but in the tricky reverse narration that impels our entwined stories, he was there to catch me when I leapt. How are we to read these entwined stories and so escape the labyrinth? Thus, Fun Home echoes Maus in a number of ways, in its focus on paternity, in its attempt to deal with suicide, in its feelings of imprisonment, in its tendency to recur on itself, rather than to proceed with absolute linearity. If Bruce Bechdel is Daedalus, He should also be a craftsman, and the book shows us early on that he is a maker of artifice. I read now from page 17. He appeared to be an ideal husband and father, for example. But would an ideal husband and father have sex with teenage boys? It's tempting to suggest in retrospect that our family was a sham, that our house was not a real home at all, but the simulacrum of one, a museum. Yet we really were a family, and we really did live in those period rooms. I can't find the scissors! Look in the Chippendale. Bechtel calls their house a simulacrum. A simulacrum is an imitation or counterfeit, an image as a representation, something having the form without the qualities. And so their home, in its ideal quality, its nature as a restored mansion, is an imitation. But it is also real, in that they live there together. Bruce is the same way. He appears a respectable family man, an ideal husband. But this is merely a form he inhabits to cloak the desire within. Little Allison sees this and knows it, as does her mother, Helen. But Bechtel, comic book artist, is also an artificer. Here she takes pictures. Throughout the comic, she draws them. Here, laying out the balanced panels in which the family's arrangement is subtly echoed by the objects on the sideboard, including the reflection, but less Allison herself. And again, like Maus, the book is filled with drawn representations of pictures. And like Maus, these are simulacra, images without proper forms. Indeed, Bechtel's very mode of drawing is to quite literally simulate her subjects from pictures, inhabit them in an effort to discover the proper qualities before drawing them. This is a ghost story of the death of the father. It is a story in which the first person vanishes into the paternal specter in order to find herself within the labyrinth of the book. So the agon of photography leads us to the center of the labyrinth, and when we turn from page 99 to page 100, exactly the turn of the page from Maus to Prisoner on the Hell Planet, we discover a splash page of a secret photo. Shortly after Dad died, I was rooting through a box of family photos and came across one I had never seen. It's low contrast and out of focus, but the subject is clearly our yard work assistant babysitter, Roy. It appears to have been taken on a vacation when I was 8, a trip on which Roy accompanied my father, my brother, and me to the Jersey Shore while my mother visited her old roommate in New York City. I remember the hotel room. My brothers and I slept in one adjoining it. The blurriness of the photo gives it an ethereal, painterly quality. Roy is gilded with morning seaside light. His hair is an aureole. In fact, the picture is beautiful. But would I be assessing its aesthetic merits so calmly if it were of a 17-year-old girl? Why am I not properly outraged? Perhaps I identify too well with my father's illicit awe. A trace of this seems caught in the photo, just as a trace of Roy has been caught on the light-sensitive paper. The picture was in an envelope labeled Family in Dad's handwriting, along with other shots from the same trip. The borders of all the photos are printed AUG 69, but on the one of Roy, Dad has carefully blotted out the 69 and 2 small bullets on either side with a blue magic marker. It is a curiously ineffectual attempt at censorship. Why cross out the year and not the month? Why, for that matter, leave the photo in the envelope at all? In an act of prestidigitation typical of the way my father juggled his public appearance and private reality, the evidence is simultaneously hidden and revealed. The photograph is from a family vacation, and it revises the past by showing Allison what she thought was real was not, offering a counter-narration, a new path in her life story. In this, she creates a recursive loop, as in Maus, where we are part of the scene, reading the photo with Allison, indeed, as Allison. And this too creates a process of identification, in which Allison is not outraged, in which she identifies with her father, even as she recognizes he is being outrageous. She notes, too, that Bruce has blotted out a pornographic pun on the margins, hiding and revealing the entire scene in his own new story of reality. So the photograph gives us an aestheticization of a painful reality. It gives us a truth, but this truth is much greater than a visual representation. It's part of a story, part of many stories, both aesthetic creation and painful recognition. I term this the sublime, a moment of unbelievability that would say, this is not so, even as it also says, this is so. The sublime, the combination of elements within a heightened reality, a sort of blowing out of the senses at the threshold of perception and understanding. This quality defines Allison's relationship to the past, for she is repeatedly cast into moments in which her understanding of the past is entirely revised, in which a new story emerges from the story she thought was in play. Here's a moment in which she reveals to her parents that she is homosexual. She is away at college and decides to write them a letter. Only 4 months earlier, I had made an announcement to my parents, I am a lesbian. My homosexuality remained at that point purely theoretical, an untested hypothesis. But it was a hypothesis so thorough and convincing that I saw no reason not to share it immediately. The news was not received as well as I had hoped. There was an exchange of difficult letters with my mother, then a phone call in which she dealt a staggering blow. Your father has had affairs with other men. What? I'd been upstaged, demoted from protagonist in my own drama to comic relief in my parents' tragedy. He was molested by a farmhand when he was young. I had imagined my confession as an emancipation from my parents, but instead I was pulled back into their orbit. And with my father's death following so hard on the heels of this doleful coming out party, I could not help but assume a cause and effect relationship. If I had not felt compelled to share my little sexual discovery, perhaps the semi would have passed without incident 4 months later. Yes, it really was a Sunbeam bread truck. Why had I told them? I hadn't even had sex with anyone yet. Conversely, my father had been having sex with men for years and not telling anyone. Why are you telling me this and not Dad? Your father? Tell the truth? Please. The line that Dad drew between reality and fiction was indeed a blurry one. To understand this, one had only to enter his library. Interestingly, her sexual revelation is a textual one, a decision not made with a bed but with a typewriter. Yet this moment of awakening is tied to a moment of revision, in which the past is rewritten before her, in which her moment of realization, of coming out, is a moment of infantilization. Helen's announcement of Bruce's sexual indiscretions knock Allison's life story out from beneath her, toppling her from her own point of self-knowledge and self-revelation to the position of a child who knows nothing. She depicts herself here as a fetus, on the floor, tied to her parents by the telephone wire's umbilical cord. And so she finds herself in a tragicomedy, which is the subtitle of the book. It is a feeling of participating in a lie, lost as a minor player in someone else's drama, someone else's book. This image of her on the floor is a repeated visual moment in the book, a non-linear point of reference for the narrative as it connects different scenes according to a visual trope. Hence the maze, the labyrinth of repeated returns, each a dead end in which Allison must try to escape. And yet, Bechtel has created this maze, realizing and writing the drawing of the situation. So I say, there is no first person in comics, because to be lost in the book, in its way, is also to soar within it, to create the self in its entirety.